Hi students, it's Mrs. Coombe here. Today I'll be talking about a lesson on the United States during the interwar years, which is the 1920s and 1930s, in between World War I and World War II, thus the interwar years. After this, you're going to read chapter 30, section 2 on totalitarianism in your textbook, which covers the rise of Stalin, and then take some notes. So let's get started. So we're going to begin really with this time period of great American transformation. Post World War I in America was a bustling and booming place. It was really highlighted by this newfound foreign policy of isolationism. Remember, America never signed the League of Nations. They never agreed to that point, which was a part of the Treaty of Versailles, which is part of that European alliance of collective security. We wanted to stay isolated or out of Europe's problems. We were the world leader after World War I. We had very little damage done in terms of from an economic perspective. In fact, it was just the opposite. We actually had a boom in production following World War I. We also crave normalcy. Normalcy is an idea that really is reflected after every major wartime. Americans want to go home to their sweethearts and loved ones and have as normal of a lifestyle as possible. That's usually also a characteristic of sometimes voting in Republican presidents or practicing conservatism. Also, Americans' characteristic this time period was the Red Scare. Many Americans feared communism. In 1917, we started seeing the rise of major problems internally in Russia. And Russia was a major power at the time period. And communism and the idea of it was a direct threat to our American system of democracy. So, this is well illustrated in this political cartoon where we have strikes, disorder, Bolshevism, which refers to the rise of the Bolshevik Party, chaos. We also saw the rise of nativism, which is a hatred of foreigners or non natives. And that was even done in immigration policies and laws, which placed quotas or a specific number on the amount of people that could come from, for example, Eastern Europe. Lastly, the rise of conservatism. These three Republican presidents, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, they were presidents throughout the 1920s. They all believed in laissez-faire economic philosophy, which states that there should be no or limited government intervention in economics. And this really encourages businesses to set little rules and restrictions because there is no government oversight. Moving on to changes in American culture, we saw the arrival of African American culture and this new type of vibrant or rebirth of culture through the Harlem Renaissance. That would not have happened without the Great Migration. It was the movement of African Americans from the South to the northern areas to work in cities and take on factory jobs. Places like Harlem, Brooklyn, the Bronx, New York City, we see Chicago, Philadelphia. These are different major cities where African Americans settled. We saw this vibrant arts movement in literature, music, writing. The list goes on and on and on. Painting, called the Harlem Renaissance, which is a celebration of this new style of African American artwork. And from that, we saw the birth of a new style of music altogether called jazz, the Jazz Age. It really sparked, was a major hit in northern cities and all throughout the US. It was a mix of ragtime and blues, and really some of the origins are in the Deep South in New Orleans. We also saw prohibition, which was the outlaw of alcohol. It banned making it, selling it, distributing it, etc. So you saw the rise of organized crime syndicates like mobs and gangs. Al Capone was one of those individuals. Consumerism was also on the rise, where Americans, for the first time ever, were buying things that they could not afford and buying it with credit or doing risky practices to play the stock market. Leisure culture also rose. We saw sports and the development of American pastimes like heading to the beach or going to Coney Island or going on a roller coaster or taking a drive in a car. These were things that more Americans were able to afford due to the effect of progressive reforms, which put caps on the number of, say, things like hours a person could work, better working conditions, outlaw of child labor, and even reforms to the education system. So here we see another image kind of focusing on those challenges for traditions. The Harlem Renaissance, some great artists there of Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, a poet, and Louis Armstrong. There's a famous Cotton Club venue. NFL was also founded. Sports like golf, swimming, tennis, baseball, boxing, you name it. These were all rising in popularity. This is the Babe right here. Also consumer products that made life easier, things like the vacuum cleaner and radio. People were starting to buy things with credit, which is also not a great thing. Women went from the Victorian age, this is the fashion on the left, to the right, which is flapper culture. It was a young woman who really started defying the old expectations of women. They would go out in public, they would go shopping with their friends to department stores, they would drink and dance and have fun, smoke, but they were, more rebellious because in 1920 we saw the passage of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote in the United States. However, the 1929 we saw a depression marked by the event of Black Tuesday and Black Friday. These were panics in the stock market where people sold off their shares very quickly. Some of the causes of this economic event, which lasted from 1929 through World War II, so really 1930s was a hard time economically for most Americans, was increasing unemployment. Some industries had already showed signs of slowing down, like in railroad, steel. We had a weak banking structure in general. Globally, many countries were struggling to pick up the pieces and recover after World War I. There was also a lack of government regulation of businesses and different practices. So certain forms of monopolies were still around, things like laissez-faire policies done by the presidents of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. The rise of consumerism, buying things that you can't afford. Overproduction of factories and farms. This led to a Midwestern environmental disaster seen right here called the Dust Bowl. Risky investment choices, buying stocks on margin is one of those things, and a massively unequal distribution of wealth. The Great Depression in the United States lasted from 1929 through the start of World War II. So the 1930s was a hard time for most Americans. This was characterized by bank failures. Over 5,000 banks closed, farms, houses, and massive unemployment losses. Most farmers were not able to afford their farming. Remember, the agricultural industry was hit very hard. People lost their jobs and were unable to afford their houses. And we saw really high rates of unemployment in the United States, about 25% of the population. FDR was voted into office. He was Democratic president. This was a huge change from the 1920s of three Republican presidents. He developed many social programs to try to provide relief, recovery, and reform to different facets of American society. So, reforming practices so that wouldn't happen again, and creating organizations and bodies to help get Americans back on their feet. Hoover, who was the first president to handle the Depression in 1929 to 1932, he believed the federal government should not provide federal aid to help Americans get back on their feet. But because the Depression was so severe and affecting 25%, most people could not afford to just have, private charities and churches and handouts help them. So we saw this rise of massive government involvement. And this whole time, his whole plan right here, FDR's plan, was called the New Deal. This is a great political cartoon I'm going to end with. And here's FDR and a sick Uncle Sam in his little slippers and jammies. And right here, these are some of the acronyms for the organizations that he's trying out. Like the National Recovery Act, not the NRA, what we think of today. And in his little doctor kit, it says New Deal. His little maid working with him or nurse working with him has the label of Congress. And FDR is saying, of course, we may have to change remedies if we don't get results. So he was a president that was willing to try many different things to help Americans get back to normal, get jobs again, and help the economy recover. So hopefully you enjoyed today's presentation, and after this, you should spend the next about 40 minutes working on the reading.